Two men named Lamech mentioned in the Bible, each with a very different legacy. The name, Lamech, appears in the book of Genesis, and witnesses pay close attention to the genealogical lines and moral distinctions between these two individuals. Much of what Jehovah's Witnesses understand and teach about Lamech comes from a careful reading of the Scriptures, combined with insights shared in Bible study aids such as the Insight on the Scriptures volumes and articles from the Watchtower and Awake magazines, all accessible through jw.org. The first Lamech, descendant of Cain. The first Lamech is introduced in Genesis chapter 4, in the lineage of Cain. Cain, of course, was Adam and Eve's first son who murdered his brother Abel. After Cain's expulsion, he had descendants who largely followed a path increasingly independent of Jehovah and out of harmony with divine moral standards. Lamech, who appears several generations down Cain's line, is mentioned specifically at Genesis chapter 4 verses 19 to 24. From the perspective of Jehovah's Witnesses, Lamech holds a notable place in biblical history, but not for honorable reasons. To begin with, Lamech broke from the original pattern of monogamous marriage established by Jehovah between Adam and Eve. At Genesis chapter 4 verse 19, we read that Lamech took two wives, Adah and Zillah. This is a significant detail often highlighted in witness commentary. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that God intended marriage to be between one man and one woman, as Genesis chapter 2 verse 24 and Jesus' later words in Matthew chapter 19 verses 4 to 6 affirm. So Lamech's decision to take two wives is seen as an early example of humanity drifting away from God's original arrangement and moral standards, underscoring a pattern of rebellion or moral laxity in the line of Cain. Another important aspect of Lamech, Cain's descendant, is the poem or song he recites in Genesis chapter 4 verses 23 to 24. This brief but striking piece of ancient Hebrew poetry is often called the Song of Lamech. In it, Lamech boasts to his wives that he killed a young man who injured him, and he then makes a bold, almost blasphemous claim. If Cain's vengeance was to be avenged 7 times, Lamech's vengeance would be 77 times. Witnesses interpret this as a display of prideful violence and self-justification. While Jehovah granted Cain some form of protective sign to prevent excessive vengeance against him after he killed Abel, Lamech takes that precedent and twists it, essentially suggesting that he can commit murder with impunity, and more so than Cain. For Jehovah's Witnesses, this passage shows how far the human race had strayed from God's principles in just a few generations. Violence was escalating, and attitudes were becoming more brazenly defiant toward divine law. Thus, the first Lamech becomes almost a symbol of moral decline and the corruption that took root apart from God's guidance. The second Lamech, from the line of Seth, Noah's father. In contrast, there is another Lamech mentioned in Genesis, found in chapter 5. This Lamech is a descendant of Seth, who was born after Abel's death and represented a more faithful line of worshippers, as suggested at Genesis chapter 4 verse 26. The Lamech in Seth's line is notable for being the father of Noah. According to Genesis chapter 5 verses 28 to 31, Seth's descendant Lamech lived 777 years, and he named his son Noah, saying, "This one will bring us comfort from our work and from the pain of our hands resulting from the ground which Jehovah has cursed." General 529, NWT. For Jehovah's Witnesses, this statement by the second Lamech indicates a measure of faith and understanding of Jehovah's purpose. He recognized that mankind was suffering under the curse placed on the ground following Adam's sin, Genesis chapter 3 verse 17, and he hoped that his newborn son Noah would somehow play a role in alleviating that hardship. While Lamech himself did not live to see the global deluge that God brought upon the wicked world of that time, he stands out as a man who had some anticipation of better things to come. He died just a few years before the flood, and Jehovah's Witnesses regard him as part of the faithful line of men, like Seth, Enosh, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah, who maintained some closeness to Jehovah's will and purpose in a world increasingly distant from righteous standards. This second Lamech's legacy is more positive than the first. Rather than being associated with polygamy, violence, and arrogance, he is remembered primarily for fathering Noah, one of the most pivotal figures in the Bible. Noah's faith, obedience, and role in constructing the ark ensured the preservation of human and animal life through the deluge, making it possible for humanity to have a fresh start in the post-flood era. Thus, Jehovah's Witnesses would say that the second Lamech aligns more closely with faithful worshippers who, despite living in a corrupted pre-flood world, still looked to Jehovah and his promises for the future. Lessons drawn from the two Lamechs. Jehovah's Witnesses frequently draw lessons from Bible accounts, believing these narratives were preserved for the spiritual instruction of God's people today. When comparing the two Lamechs, one can see a stark contrast. The first Lamech, in the line of Cain, glorified violence and deviated from God's moral standard, even in marriage. The second Lamech, from the line of Seth, appears to have held a measure of faith in Jehovah's promise and expressed hope that the curse on the ground would be lifted, reflecting a more righteous inclination. From the witness perspective, this illustrates how divergent human families and cultures became within just a few generations of Adam. Keep faith alive, trust in Jehovah's promises, and live by divine principles as best they could. Lamech, Noah's father, stands as proof that even in challenging times, worshippers of Jehovah can remain distinct and hopeful. Please